Well, welcome back, and thanks for joining us for this breakout session this afternoon on the particular challenges facing institutions of Christian higher education in this time and what the future holds for these schools. Thanks for tuning in for the sessions earlier today, and sorry for the slight technical difficulties in the last session. We'll hope we avoid those the rest of this afternoon. Again, welcome to those of you just joining now to this breakout session on the future of Christian higher education. My name is Tyler Castle, and I direct AEI's initiative on faith and public life, which exists to help Christian college students and faculty think deeply about the intersection of faith, politics and public policy, economics, and society. As an initiative, we're deeply invested in this discussion this afternoon, and we think that institutions of Christian higher education have a critical role in American society. And that being the case, while this discussion today will be sober about the real challenges that these institutions face, we also hope that it's fundamentally optimistic about their future. One housekeeping note, which is that we will once again at the end of this breakout session have time for Q&A. So please submit your questions starting as soon as you'd like through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if possible, submit your questions with your full name and your school so we know who they're coming from. So I'm really happy now to introduce our three panelists for this discussion. Couldn't think of better people to lead us in these reflections about the future of Christian higher ed. First is Shirley Hoogstra, who, as many of you know, has been the president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities since 2014. For those of you who don't know that institution, the CCCU is a higher education association of more than 180 Christian institutions around the world. Many of your schools are a member of the CCCU. Shirley holds a JD and has a background in law, and before her current role, she spent 15 years as vice president for student life at Calvin University, which was also her undergraduate alma mater. Next, we're also joined by Gayle Bebe, who has been the president of Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California since 2007. He previously served as president of Spring Arbor University in Michigan for 7 years. He has an educational background both in theology and in business. And if you notice me nodding approvingly at everything he says during this session, I should offer a disclaimer that I'm a Westmont alumnus myself and benefited greatly from his leadership during my time at Westmont. And then finally, we're joined by Kevin Brown, who is the newly inaugurated president as of last fall of Asbury University in Kentucky. He previously served as an associate dean and professor in Asbury's business school, and he also spent 4 years teaching at Anderson University in central Indiana. Prior to that, he worked for nearly a decade at Wells Fargo Bank, spending the last 4 years there as a market president. He's been a friend of our initiative for many years, so we're really grateful that he could join us once again for this event. So thank you to all of you for joining us, spending the afternoon to reflect on these important questions. And I'd like to start with, just kind of the real situation that we've faced this spring and that we still face this summer and fall. So the COVID pandemic obviously came out of nowhere. Some people were maybe expecting it to be a big deal early 2020, but before that, who knew about it? And as Kevin just said earlier, as a first-year president, you don't have a COVID-19 pandemic handbook that you can reference as you're responding to these challenges. So I'd love to maybe start with you, Kevin, and then you, Gayle, and hear, how did your schools and you as leaders respond to this pandemic in the spring semester, and what's your current thinking on the summer and fall?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. And so great to be with everyone today. It was, I could tell you stories about some of the strangest days of employment I've ever had as we shifted into COVID-19. I'll say this, our posture from the beginning was to, as best we can, make decisions in tandem with the information that was provided to us so that we didn't prematurely commit ourselves to any unnecessary disruption or loss of continuity. And that was obviously very difficult because information was changing some days by the hour. We immediately established 3 committees. The first was just a COVID-19 management team. And this is a group that still meets. We met this morning to think carefully about what information is available, what do we know, and then how do we orient and organize around that. So working remotely, return to work, some of these issues, the decision to immediately move to an online modality during our spring break and finish the semester that way, that all occurred through that committee. We have another committee that was just more of a scenario planning, a what if committee. And so this allowed us to think through several different scenarios that may occur, that are likely to occur this fall, and then plan accordingly based upon that. And that group has been meeting for several months now. And then finally, we created a more proactive group. We called it an APART group. This was just an acronym, Asbury Planning and Response Team, I think it was. But what do we need to be thinking about on the other side of this pandemic to be a thriving Christian institution in the next decade? And what indelible imprint will the pandemic leave upon the collective psyche of prospective students in the United States that we need to prepare for? And so that's been an exciting group to be a part of as well. But as of now, our plan is very much on-campus, in-person operations this fall that prioritizes the safety, security, care, and support of all of our students. And again, our posture has not been one of risk elimination, but really risk management, so that as our students come, as some likely will contract the virus, that we have a plan for them to be tested, quarantined as is necessary, and then to maintain their educational continuity during that time. So that's our plan at this period.
How about you, Gayle? You're muted.
How's that? Okay. Well, Tyler, you'll remember your freshman year, your first year, we spent that November 12th, 13th night and day in the gym as the Tea Fire engulfed the campus and the surrounding community. And one of the things that we continue to draw on is the experience that we've developed over the years responding to not pandemics, but to crisis, fires, mudslides, debris flows, evacuations. And what's interesting is if you can build essentially institutional knowledge, it becomes incredibly valuable when you pivot into a pandemic. This is like the 08-09 economic implosion in that it's impacting everybody. But it's very different from the Tea Fire or the Montecito mudslide and debris flow, because those were episodes that only impacted Westmont and the closely held community and had no impact on the rest of the world. And so keeping both in mind as we've responded has been very, very advantageous. Because we have all of this experience responding to crises, we actually have a day every year. It's called Ready Day, and it's the Tuesday following commencement, where we just spend a day talking about what is the next crisis we could face and how do we prepare for it. So this year, we were already in the pandemic. We spent that day talking about how will we repopulate. And we had already divided the executive team, 5 VPs and provosts, into oversight of some pretty general areas that coincide with each of their responsibilities. And then we used Ready Day to divide them further into subcommittees that could cover essentially everything that we need to get done, from how will we offer classes, what will the classrooms need to be like, how will we sterilize them after each use, how will we welcome new students to campus this fall. We went through the whole gamut, and so we now have 5 major committees and 48 subcommittees. They'll submit their plan for how we'll repopulate on June 5th. That'll be the first draft, and then we'll finalize the plan June 30th. And from July 1 until August 31, when we hope that we open the semester face-to-face, we will work to get ready. We've already made purchases on what we consider critical equipment that we'll need that may be hard to get. We're going to be doing the testing. We're going to be doing the isolating. We're going to be doing the contact tracing. We've reached out to our alumni network to train them in how to do remote contact tracing. And so it's just rippling through. Meanwhile, we needed to finish the year. This is the last week of our fiscal year. Our fiscal year is June 1 to May 31. We needed to be sure we finished strong. One of the advantages of a National Liberal Arts College is our revenue intake is actually two pretty specific periods, fall semester and spring semester. We are losing some revenue from the front edge of our summer conference season, which is pretty robust now. It'll have a bigger impact on next fiscal year. But we're on track to finish the year in the black, which was very important. Meanwhile, we've got to get ready to absorb all these new expenses as we prepare to really open campus for face-to-face instruction this fall. One other thing I'll say is that obviously we make all these plans in conversation with the state and federal government, and we can't open unless we get to phase 3 of the 4 phases in California, and we're in phase 2 right now. So we like the fact that the economy is getting opened back up because it gives us a test run on how people will populate and how they'll behave. But it's going to be a challenge unlike any we've faced, but it's also an opportunity for us to really learn in a way that will prepare us not only how to get through this pandemic, but for future challenges that come to the college.
So I'd love to hear from you, Shirley. I know the CCCU has been actively seeking to come alongside schools and provide support and guidance during this time. Could you tell us a little bit about those efforts, and what are the resources or other things that Christian colleges and universities should be aware of at this time?
So, can you hear the background noise? Unfortunately, hold on. Just go to a different question. I'd like to come back to that.
Okay, great. Well, I'd love to hear from you, Gayle and Kevin. Just going forward a little bit, thinking about the long-term financial feasibility of these schools. Obviously, a lot of small liberal arts schools, not just Christian schools, but a lot of small schools across the country have been concerned about serious budget shortfalls and long-term financial stability even before this pandemic. And some people are saying that the pandemic, if anything, will accelerate some of the realities that those institutions face. So how do you think about institutions such as yours, thinking about this coming academic year, which could face which could provide a particular challenge, but then also setting yourselves up for long-term financial stability?
Well, I think it's been just remarkable to get federal aid for faith-based higher ed, and that's a huge win for Shirley and for the whole private independent sector. First time ever. And so that tells you how big the crisis is. And I think you have to look at the fact that this isn't just something that is a crisis for faith-based higher ed. This is literally an existential threat to industries that we thought were immune to any challenge. I mean, just this morning I was reading about Hertz and it's filing for bankruptcy, a company that's more than 100 years old. We know all the other ones that are teetering on the brink. But there's always pockets, and I've learned this in each crisis that we've faced, that there are always pockets that are flourishing. And in this case, Zoom is obviously flourishing. Other software and high-tech companies are just having a boom time. And so if you have donors in those sectors, which a California-based school has a number of donors that come out of those sectors, some of our donors are getting hammered. But others of our donors are just flourishing. And those become the ones that actually come alongside you during a challenge. And I think we'll all go through, anybody who isn't in the top 100 endowments is going to go through a really significant, it's not even a correction, it's just a compression. I was on a webinar last week that included the president of Harvard, president of the University of Virginia, the president of Kenyon College, and the president of Wellesley. So 2 national liberal arts, 2 research ones. And it was fascinating to hear them talk because nobody had pity for the Harvard president, but he was talking about, even though he has a humongous endowment, you plan to spend a certain amount and you have to go through severe contraction when you no longer have that money. I think all of us will have to scramble to make it I think it's very likely that most, if not all of us, will make it. I don't agree with the scenarios that say 750 to 1,000 colleges will go out of business between now and 5 years from now. I think small liberal arts colleges have a very robust role to play. And I think part of what we're seeing is people actually are tired of Zoom. It's giving us a great opportunity to discover what works on Zoom, what we enjoy about Zoom, what we want to do academically, what we want to do co-curricular, but it also makes us long for face-to-face interaction and all the learning that happens beyond the transmission of information. And so I think we will struggle. I think we'll probably have a 2-year struggle, but I anticipate by the end of 2022 that we'll begin to see a real uptick, both in terms of the strength of faith-based higher ed, as well as the sector as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with that. In 2009, Mitch Daniels, who's the president of Purdue, at that time he was the governor of Indiana, he met with the college and university presidents within the state and just said, you know, in the wake of this financial crisis, whatever happens, don't plan to return to the status quo, because that's gone. The way things were no longer exists. And I think there's some wisdom there that we need to pay attention to. I think there are dimensions of our world, our society that are changing. But at the same time, I think COVID-19 has actually, in some ways, just accelerated changes that were already inevitable. And we need to think of what those are in the context of higher education. I used to share with my econ students to get them thinking economically this quote economist had given years ago, where he said, the best way to combat high gas prices are higher gas prices, which sounds very counterintuitive to the lay ear. But his point was simply that gas prices are high, but they're not high enough for consumers to actually alter their behaviors in the long term and producers to do the same. And so I think that moment is at the doorstep of higher education. So for us and for a lot of other schools, I think it's taken a very hard look at the dimensions of the institution that are robust and mission critical. Those certainly for Asbury, for other faith-based schools, the elements of preparation and maturation, the formative experience of our students. But there are also elements that we can think more carefully about. Tyler, a few years ago, had a fascinating faculty retreat on the future of Christian higher education. I remember I texted my wife during this and I said, fascinating and terrifying. And one of the things we presented on at that was the work of Salim Ismail. He's written a book called Exponential Organization. And he has this fantastic quote in there where he says that the traditional business model is to take a product or a service or an experience and build this superstructure around it, a legal structure, a workforce, et cetera, and just sell access to scarcity. And then he follows that up by saying, what happens when the thing you're selling access to is no longer scarce? Well, if we're purveyors of information, we're already irrelevant if education is simply the transmission of knowledge. So I think that's forcing us to think very carefully about where has information been democratized through technology, and how can we harness that in a way that's actually student-centric and beneficial to them from a price standpoint? And then what are these other dimensions of our institution that really are scarce and non-transferable and represent the essence of who we are? So that's the moment that we're in, and we are compressed. But the economist and perhaps naive optimist in me thinks that under those conditions of compression, sometimes a better equilibrium, a better model emerges.
Shirley, anything to add about the current things that Christian colleges should be aware of related to the pandemic, but also the long-term kind of fiscal health of these schools?
Yeah, so I would agree with Kevin and with Gayle that crisis brings clarity. And actually, one of the problems that you have when you are just a little bit not compressed enough is that you try to do too many things. And you actually work closer to a famine than to a fully nourished kind of environment. And I think that this is going to really produce hard decision making, which is going to clarify the purpose of every institution. And I think across the country, I sit on the ACE board. I'm part of the Washington Higher Education Secretariat. And we are all looking at the ways that we can do what we can do best. And in Christian higher education, I think that there are some wonderful, unique distinctives that only we can do best. And it's the kind of thing we're going to need post-pandemic. I think we saw the studies which said that people are really looking to think about the big questions in life, the spiritual questions in life, and we prepare students and we prepare society through our students to be able to think and guide and really express why God matters in the world today. And that's a niche and that's a distinctive that I know that Christian higher education will hold on to tightly.
Great. So yeah, I'd love to pivot to that a little bit. Just in view of all these challenges, some people might ask, why is an expensive Christian liberal arts education worth keeping around? Why is it worth pursuing? Why is it worth offering when there are so many other educational offerings out there? So maybe you could further Shirley's point that the challenges that we face in this time, and especially post-pandemic, serious challenges and uncertain future require certain formative virtues and a character that institutions of Christian higher education have a particular knack at producing. But whether it's that or something else, I would love to hear from each of you. How do you make the case that this type of education in our contemporary time is worth it? Maybe Gayle, go ahead.
To jump in? Tyler, I think all of us as faith-based higher ed started off as liberal arts colleges, and even though people have added to, none of us have gone away from that. Westmont does it exclusively. And what I love about faith-based higher ed from a liberal arts perspective is it teaches you how to think, it teaches you how to make decisions, and it teaches you how to have a moral compass. And so we talk all the time about rigorous academics, deep love for God. And then the liberal arts, that it's not just a rigorous rote approach to learning, but it's how do you gain access to all areas of knowledge so that you can find the solutions for new problems from any area of knowledge. One of the things I learned during my MBA program with Peter Drucker was he said, you have got to learn how to learn in every discipline because you don't know what the future will bring. And when you face the future, you want to be able to work into any or reach into any area of knowledge in order to gain your solution. And then I think about the focus on the undergraduate. The undergraduate, such a pivotal period. Meg Jay, a UVA professor, writes about 30 is not the new 20. And that 7 of the 10 most important decisions we make in life are either made or are being set up to be made during our 20s. And that this isn't just a throwaway time, but it's the most pivotal, critical period of your life, and you don't see it that way until it's over in many cases. And then the residential experience. How do we learn to live together with difference? One of the things that Shirley has really highlighted during her leadership of CCCU is how do we become civic and civil in our interaction as Christians in the public square? That is a huge missing ingredient. When we talk with parents and students about we want you to learn how to live together with difference, so that you can enter society and actually be constructive members rather than polarizing forces. That is just an attractive, appealing idea. And so when you look at what happens in the context of our campuses, you have to have this opportunity to learn and to mature into ways in which we can be civic, civil Christians in the public square, able to really be that element of Christ transforming culture, not just pushing away or just bombing culture, but really transformative agents that make a compelling witness for Christ. And I think that's at the core of what we do so well.
Tyler, I love that answer, Gayle. And I believe that the questions are getting tougher. There are just harder and harder questions that we have to face as a world together. And I think that Christian higher education allows us to be relevant if we'll do this. We have to ask the toughest questions with a complete lens. And I think what Christian higher education does is allows us to have the complete lens. And that is, how does a sovereign God interact with an earth that he created? So why do we care about the earth and creation care? Why do we care about the fact that in this pandemic, we've actually seen the earth change because of lack of overuse that we see when we're all out and about? What will we learn from that? And then in terms of incivility, I think we are just seeing that now become a norm. Now, if you look at history, you can read about the Lincoln debates, and those were pretty rough and ragged. And we know a lot of times when but they were not as universally ubiquitous as they are today. And so now every person has to have cultural competencies in civility, or we're not going to be able to actually move in a noble way in a society that we really admire and respect.
Yeah, I agree with that. Both of those comments are excellent. I'll just quickly add maybe something more personal. My testimony really is that this very fascinating age of 18 to 22, where you're a young adult and you are being formed and you're away from home and you're asking perhaps questions you never asked. And I had men and women who invested in me and fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life. And at the end of the day, it is locking arms with those students to do just that, to ask these big questions, but to prepare themselves to go out into a very complex marketplace to shape the world for Christ. The other thing I'd add too is we talk a lot about preparation, market preparation, transfer of knowledge. Those are very important, and they have to be a component of the student's experience, and we have to do it really well, and the education has to be rigorous. I appreciated what Gayle said. But it's also, I would argue, just a part of the human teleology when we look at Scripture and take seriously in Colossians that we can have fullness, a completeness in Christ, or Paul talking about taking hold of the life that really is life, or Jesus saying, I've come that you can have this abundant, this complete, this all-around life, that we're preparing students for the best version of themselves. So we're chartered as an educational institution, but our educational paradigm is informed by these epistemic claims about a created people and a created order by a deliberate creator. And I think that changes everything. Stanley Hauerwas has a great quote where he says, the stupidest thing a Christian can say is, I believe in Jesus Christ and his resurrection, but then again, that's just my personal belief. If we believe in these things, these claims about reality, it alters everything. It changes everything. And we're absorbing ourselves, our community, into this story so that we can come in and go out and be ambassadors for Christ and live our best life in light of that.
Go ahead, Gayle.
The only thing I just want to amplify, I have loved interacting with faculty at each of the campuses that I've been a part, because they have gone into disciplines and gained mastery of them. And they bring an intellectual capacity into every area of human learning, not just faith learning, but truly becoming great scientists, great economists, great poets, great scholars in their field. And then they bring in this conversational piece of their faith in God, their commitment to Christ, and the way in which that gives them a unique insight, both into their own life and into their discipline. And I often think about these questions that we used to ask when Dallas Willard was alive and coming to campus. And he'd say, what is the good life? Who is a good person? And how do I become the kind of person who can discover, and live the good life? And I think at the heart of what we're doing is, no matter what discipline you feel called to study and eventually serve, we all want to live the good life. And we want it to be a life that honors God and furthers the purposes of Christ. And I think Christian higher education is so vital in helping us develop that capacity and really bring it to fruition.
So Tyler, you asked a good question, and I want to add something about what the Barna Group and David Kinnaman has been talking about talking about resilient disciples. And you can't actually build a resilient disciples without the ingredients that really happen on a Christian college campus, which is community and practice and role models, like you're saying, Gayle, around faculty members. When I was a lawyer in New Haven, Connecticut, people that were my clients would have the opportunity to ask me about my beliefs and my faith. And I remember thinking I would never be able to share why God is so important to me and why he's part of my daily breathing if I hadn't gone to a Christian college where those kinds of things were talked about in the classroom, where I saw in the law why God was present in the kinds of things we were doing, and yet also present in our individual lives. I was done with a court case, and a client and I went out for coffee after the court appearance, and he was really distraught, and he felt sort of purposeless. He was having some very difficult times. And then he said to me, Shirley, I understand that you pray. Why do you pray? And I thought to myself, that's the kind of question that you get prepared to talk about because you're comfortable integrating your faith into all of your life. And so I was really grateful that I had invested in a Christian college education for that kind of really important question with a client in a law practice.
So just one quick follow-up question, and then I'm going to turn to some participant questions. And that's, I think all three of you really beautifully described what Christian colleges do provide that's unique in this time. But the people that need to be convinced probably mostly are parents and students. And I wonder if you could just talk about that marketing effort, or hopefully it's a little bit more personal than just a marketing effort. But how have you done that effectively? How do you think about that? There needs to be a demand for that type of thing, for that unique type of education, if people are going to pay money for it. So how do you think about kind of telling that message and marketing it to students and parents?
One thing I would quickly say related to that, Tyler, I think there are two stories that tend to emerge when we talk about, for example, a liberal arts institution. And one is you can either get this ivory tower, interesting liberal arts education, but then be saddled with debt, unemployable, living in your parents' basement, or you can get a narrow, attenuated technical degree and at least be assured a job. And this is just a false trade-off. That narrative is not correct. And when you look at a lot of different reports, some of which have come out recently, they're telling a much different story. A few relevant considerations. I've been fascinated by this statistic, and I've shared it a lot. The Future Institute, they have said that in 2030, 85% of the jobs that will exist in that year do not exist today. And we know that automation is going to be a reality in the future, and we don't know the degree of the disruption. I'm optimistic, but there's going to be some degree of change that occurs through that. We're shifting from a manufacturing economy into something more like a service or a creativity economy, new channels of exchanging value. And of course, I've already mentioned we're in this information age as well. But one relevant takeaway from this is I don't know what 2030 or 40 will be like, but we can look at those perennial skills that will still outlast the dynamism that we can expect in the time to come. Critical thinking and problem solving, the capacity to collaborate with others, the ability to articulate oneself and communicate, our judgment, our decision making, our service mentality, the virtues, the capacities that we have as individuals. These are robust enough to endure through the speed of change that we see. And those are sensibilities, those are competencies that are very much inculcated through a liberal arts paradigm. So I wouldn't want to fully instrumentalize the liberal arts, but I certainly would want to elevate that this is a very important educational experience on the menu when we think about the current moment that we're in. And I don't know if we tell that story well enough sometimes.
Gayle?
Yeah, oh, Kevin, great answer. Let me just see if I can amplify a couple things that really resonated with me. One is the whole advent of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the Internet of Things, and how do we become conversant in it? One of my favorite profs at Westmont, Don Patterson, this is his specialty, his background, and he is so effective at helping us understand both what it can do and what it can't do, and recognizing the limits. No matter how far we've gone technologically, it has not displaced the human person as a center of value, meaning, and purpose. And so how do we blend the best of artificial intelligence and machine learning with this human quest to find meaning in life? And I think that that's just a critical piece of what we're doing. In addition, I always try to make the case, and I think we have to, that we have a number of ideals that drive us, but we have a number of practical realities, including our career development and calling program. And what is that? It is meant to be something that from the day you land at Westmont and the day you land at any of our faith-based institutions, you're thinking not just about your academic program and doing well in your classes. You're thinking about, what has God put me on earth to do, and how do I live into that? How do I become equipped to be the best expression of myself? That's a question. It's not just a question that we raise, it's a question that we resource. And I think in so many of these cases, the fact that we are willing to resource priorities that other institutions are not going to resource in the same way is pivotal. And we want you to be grounded. We want you to be grounded in a vocation. We want you to be grounded in your faith. I also want you to be an active church person. And so part of what I hope happens to you during your time at Westmont is you get the full complement of who you are as a person. You get the full opportunity to develop the capacities to enter a vocation successfully. I also want you to become committed to the purposes of God in the world, including the purposes of the church, the one organization He's created to carry forth His mission on earth. And those are questions and priorities that we get to set that you would never be able to set at an independent or a public, non-faith-based institution.
I'm just going to add one short fact that sort of answers this question about the quality. Christian college graduates have the highest repayment rate and the lowest default rate on their student loans. And I think that says a lot. I think that says that they're well employed, and I think they have a character that lets them keep their promises. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking to do with our system. So.
Well, and Shirley, to amplify that, I think there's metrics now that just really help us track how our alums are doing, and those are, I think those are really important stats. It's not the end all. We sometimes get criticized by some of the purists for even mentioning it, but I think it's an important part of the whole narrative that our students do well. They're ethical, they're responsible, but they also learn how to contribute in very meaningful ways.
Great. Well, let's turn to some of the participant questions. We've got a couple, one from Chuck North at Baylor and one from Brad Hale at Azusa Pacific, about the relation between administrative employees and teaching employees. And this is not unique to Christian colleges, but there's been a lot of talk over the last decade or more about how administrative employees have grown exponentially relative to the number of teaching employees. And so I don't know who wants to take a first stab at this, but is that problematic? Should we be pushing against that? How is that a unique problem for Christian colleges?
Well, I think it is a unique problem. My first higher ed job was at Azusa Pacific, and my last position there, I was dean of the School of Theology. We were asked to deliver 60% of the curriculum with full-time faculty, 40% with adjunct faculty, and we never made it. We delivered so much of the curriculum by adjunct faculty, and I saw a statistic recently that it had tilted even more. At Westmont, because it's always been a priority, and particularly because we're isolated on the south central coast of California, we deliver 89% of our curriculum with full-time faculty. Now, what does that mean? That's the most expensive model. It's also the one that gives you the greatest control of quality. And so what's happened is, as we have moved, when I was at Azusa, we would talk about all of our classes are taught by PhDs or people with either pursuing the terminal degree in their field or already earning it. that was true, except it didn't account for the fact that we would hire so many adjuncts that actually were finishing their degree and weren't even a core part of the university. And I think that you really have to be careful that you not erode. It takes years to become a specialist in your field. My PhD is in philosophy of religion. It's one of the longest ones to get through. But so you spend all this time, and then you come out, and institutions basically want to pay you part-time rates. That does not encourage people to actually build kind of a robust intellectual culture that can sustain the Christian movement in our country, let alone around the world. And part of what I think is our calling. Our calling includes creating these atmospheres where Christian scholars can land, can grow, can nourish, and can contribute so that it not only enriches their individual institutions, but really enriches the global church.
Shirley, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to address the sort of changing student population that probably is causing some of the administrative and faculty a difference. So if you look at 20 years ago and the student of today, we all know that the student of today is more anxious, more depressed, and we would have probably more mental health counselors and staff in order to address that. Just as pandemic, we're going to need health service administrative individuals. Working in the government relations work, I see how many unfunded mandates there are. So for instance, the new Title IX regulations came out, and now you have to have specialists who are usually administrators who are doing the Title IX adjudications and investigators, sometimes faculty, but it takes away from their faculty work. And then you look at student success. I think some people would say that students don't seem quite as prepared to enter into the kind of college level readiness we hope. And we want them to succeed. We want their retention to be high. So we have more administrators there. And then in addition, just in, let's say, your academic fields, there's just more and more work to be done that takes you out of the classroom, and that maybe skews your administrative field and rank versus your faculty field and rank. I don't think it's malevolent. I think it's about responding to the current issues of the day that just require a level of sophistication that we didn't expect from colleges in the past, but now are required to give.
I will say we have a mostly faculty audience here, so there is some slight bias behind that question.
That's good. Keep them coming.
Kevin, do you have anything to add?
I think Shirley put it perfectly well. It's a delicate balance between being a good steward and exercising efficiencies where they're available and necessary, with what is a student-centric approach and what's the human capital necessary to elevate their experience when they're on campus.
Tyler, could I amplify just the point a little?
Sure.
One of the things that I have found is that if you'll track faculty-student loads, and you see some of your all-star faculty that have courses that don't attract, if they're elective classes, they may not attract a lot. Rather than just looking for a way to cut, look for a way to amplify. And one of the things that I have loved at Westmont, we started the Augustine Scholars Program, and it was like it was in parallel. I was thinking about doing it. A core faculty member was thinking, what could we do if we had an honors program? And we had a donor who wanted to do something magnificent for the college. That gave us the opportunity to do this. What this individual has done has been able to look at some of the faculty who really just are all-star faculty, but have undersubscribed classes, and rather than have them continue to teach undersubscribed classes, shift their load into the Augustinian Scholars Program, where they've been able to have a core contributing role to play in the life of the college. Now, what does that mean? It's meant that we had to be adaptive. We had to be flexible. We had to create an alternative way in which they could fulfill their load. And I totally believe you've got to, if you have a faculty member that isn't making their load, year in and year out, you've got to figure out a way to redeploy that resource. You can't just teach a subject into the ground, but you can also look for ways in which they can enhance the mission of your institution rather than just deplete it. And in so many cases, faculty are smart enough to make the adaptation if they're given the invitation to do so.
I think Jesse Covington, who Gayle was mentioning, is on the call. So good shout out for my former
Jesse's the guy. Jesse, that's awesome. Glad to know it.
Great. Well, one related question is from Brian McGraw at Wheaton College. And he asks, are there any possibilities that schools across the CCCU network could achieve economies of scale with respect to sharing administrative benefits or low demand majors? Maybe Shirley, you could start. Are there any creative initiatives that could allow some schools in the CCCU network to share some of those things that would be better done in an economy of scale while doing the things like in-person teaching that can't be scaled like that?
I think this is exactly one of the positive benefits that might come out of a COVID situation, where people are willing to get together and say, how can we share the back end of the house sorts of things in order to get economies of scale? So I think that question is right on, and I think we should be looking to see some of that in the next 2 to 3 years, if not earlier.
Any thoughts from anyone on what that could look like?
Well, I've been involved in this experiment at Adrian College that Jeff Docking has put together in terms of collaboration around high-tech classes and partnerships on coding and whatnot. The biggest question that you run into with faculty is this of the quality that reflects our own campus? And faculty are very hesitant to just automatically give credit for other courses without being able to scrutinize it. And so I think it'll require some participation there. The things that I think will be reconstituted because of COVID, what are we learning? We're learning that we can actually be online together without being in Washington, D.C. Up until the coronavirus hit, I still had a full schedule slated for this spring that was going to require 5 different trips to the East Coast. I did all of them compressed, stayed in Santa Barbara, got to participate fully in the events, and didn't have to bear the burden of travel. It'll be interesting to me to see how that reality makes us more open to innovation curricularly. In other words, we all moved into a Zoom environment, which we never would have done without the crisis. Having moved into it, we've discovered things that we actually like, or that aren't better than, but are an alternative to. And in that, we're realizing we don't have to travel to all the conferences all the time. We don't have to teach face-to-face all the time, even though we prefer it. And that's going to help us innovate. And I think it's too early to tell what the innovation will be, but I definitely think as we repopulate, hopefully this fall, we'll all be able to teach face-to-face. We're going to do our teaching differently because we've learned we can do it differently.
I agree with all that. I like the word discover our discoveries through this process. And I would just simply say the key question is, will we respond to what we discover? That will be the key question for collaboration.
So we have a few questions about whether Christian institutions should be worried about receiving federal funds. And this is related to larger conversations about how do Christians and institutions live in a contemporary society where some of our traditional views are not accepted in the same way that they used to be. So maybe you could particularly comment on the question about should colleges be concerned about taking federal funds, whether it's related to the pandemic or otherwise, and more broadly, how do you see Christians as individuals and as institutions being both principled but compassionate and winsome in this changing and increasingly pluralistic society that we live in?
I'll just share. Yes, I think there's always a concern, and you want to read the fine print to make sure there aren't hooks that are inconsistent with your missionality. So that's always a concern. I think I really appreciated a comment Barry Corey from Biola had made a few years ago, where he was asked about what it means to be a robust faith-based institution in California. And he said, the endurance of Biola will be directly proportionate to the perceived social value that it offers to society. And I think there's a lot of truth and a lot of wisdom there, that if you say evangelical today, that's going to evoke all kinds of imagery, much of which is not favorable, but it's not an accurate reflection of the evangelical world. Some of you are familiar with Nassim Taleb, the Black Swan. He talks a lot, as do statisticians, about silent evidence. In other words, there's a difference between incidence and prevalence. Prevalence being the occurrence relative to the non-occurrence. So when we hear evangelical leaders like a few years ago say, we're in an evangelical crisis, well, maybe, but that's not reflecting on, that's not considering the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of faithful men and women that go about serving Jesus Christ on a daily basis and serving their neighbor, but don't make it into the news headlines. And so I think there is a place to continue to be humble, but also deliberate about telling that story. And Shirley has done a tremendous job with the CCCU over the last half decade of being far more deliberate about our institutions, telling our story. Shirley encouraged Asbury, for example, to do a community survey of our economic impact. It was huge. And I've been sharing this report with all of our state representatives because there is a story to be told there. So I think that, I'll say this, I've been very deliberate to use this quote, Gypsy Smith, British evangelist, but he said there are 5 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian, and most people will never read the first 4. So we are a walking gospel. We are being read. And I think that as we go into territory, and I would encourage you all to read some of John Inazu's work on this or listen to him. He's been fantastic and has visited our campus. But as we go into very difficult territory, are we also offering something to society that if they waved a magic wand and Christian institutions disappeared, they would be able to say, I don't want to live in that reality. And I think that's very important.
I really just think we have so many opportunities in front of us, and I often think thriving congregations make for thriving faith-based colleges. And if we don't have a robust, healthy, vital church, it is a danger. That's probably the biggest danger to any of our institutions. It'll force us to change in order to survive, and none of us want to do it. And so as I get invited into some of these conversations on the rise of the nuns, those who no longer express any faith, it's still fascinating to me how many people in the U.S. self-identify as Christian of some ilk. One of the things that's been interesting at Westmont is the growth of our Roman Catholic students, and over 10% of our population is now Roman Catholic. When I talk to them, I ask them, what attracted you to a college that's so clearly a Protestant evangelical institution? And they said, it's more like us than the Catholic options that we looked at and considered. And I love that answer. They feel more at home in an environment that honors their faith, encourages them in their faith, and allows them to bring their faith into the classroom so that they learn really how to live and to think in the spirit of the great saints of the church. And we are so reliant on a robust church. And if we ever lose our connection or that is a priority, that really will do harm to ourselves.
I really love the question, Tyler, because it really asks us to, as Christians, think with 2 eyes. And so in my role in Washington, we want a wonderful story to tell. So we do this Young Alum Award, and every year our campuses send in stories about what our alum are doing all over the world. And so we share those stories. And the second thing we look for is ways in which not just to ask for ourselves, like we want more Pell Grants or we want this for our education. What we try to do is be a really trusted, incredible voice around immigration reform. So Christian colleges have a wonderful record because we're part of the Evangelical Immigration Table. We're on record in terms of letters and in terms of being in offices and speaking up and or against policies that just don't represent a Christian viewpoint. The prison education, we have 22 campuses that are involved with prison education, actually getting and changing the culture inside of prisons, which is true prison reform, and then graduates of incarcerated institutions, they get to go out and get a job. And so it's such a fully orbed sort of solution. Those are the kinds of things we get to speak about, as well as speaking up against the racism we see. And we can't have this podcast or webinar go by to not say that, again, we have a George Floyd story. And Christians need to be the first, not just to speak up, but to be having evidence in our campuses about how we're teaching about the sin of racism. And again, this is why being at a Christian college, when you look at racism, it is a fully dimensional kind of conversation, which starts with the fall, and that's where also the answer lies. So anyway, we have to be absolutely winsome. Now, the other I, so winsome is good, having things to talk about and be, and but then we have writing an amicus brief because the city of Philadelphia does not allow Catholics to have grants anymore because they do not adopt to LGBT families. So where do religious principles reside, and where can the government coerce you to let go of your religious principles? And so we watch that carefully, and we file briefs to say that America is a large enough place to have differences of opinion and still be able to express that in ways that affect the common good for the better. So it's two I's. Who are we? And then what do we stand for? And then, of course, how do we express ourselves?
Tyler, can I come in just real quick on that? I really appreciate that. One of our faculty members teaches implicit bias. She's a social psychologist. That has been the most user-friendly way to get at the issue of prejudice and racism, and I've loved her work. Carmel Saad's her name. In terms of taking money from the federal government, I'm just glad that they finally provided it, because we have provided a huge service to American society for over 100 years. And I really hope that if more is to come, that we'll use it prudently, that we won't squander it, but that we'll use it in order to keep our institutions whole, or at least in compliance with bank covenants. And I think it's just been one of those times where, you know, thanks be to God, Betsy DeVos is our Secretary of Education at a time when we all needed somebody who would advocate for us. I can't imagine another Secretary of Education in which we would have been at the table being eligible to receive funds along with every other institution. So I'm grateful.
Great. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and so I'd like to ask one closing question that you could each comment on briefly, and that's a little bit of prognostication. What do you think the next 10 to 15 years hold for Christian higher education? What might the landscape look like in 10 to 15 years? And specifically, what's one thing that you think we should be worried about, but what's one thing that you think we should be optimistic and hopeful about? Maybe I'll have Kevin go first.
Yeah, that's a great question. This goes to something both Gayle and Shirley alluded to earlier. I think human beings will always ask a set of deep questions that, if not answered in some sufficient way, will haunt them. Questions of their origin. Where did I come from? What is purposeful to me? What's my identity? How do I know who I am? How do I construct meaning? How do I adjudicate between right and wrong? And what will happen to me when I die? And so there is a rich and wonderful history of the faith tradition wrestling with these questions in very complex ways. And I think we'll always have a seat at the table so long as we can winsomely and compellingly both answer these questions and offer service to the larger world. The threat, I would say, is if we rest on our laurels that we have a narrative for those questions. If we think that that is enough to substantiate the amount of money today that we're asking individuals to exchange in order to populate our institutions, that's going to be a very difficult proposition moving forward because of the proliferation of educational substitutability, which is just continuing to grow. It is easier today than any other time in human history to get 3 credit hours or get a class and have that substitute for something else. And so I think thinking very carefully about what our value is within a Christian context really will be the future of education, and doing that in a way that someone's willing to exchange money for that value.
Shirley? Or
No, that's fine.
Just 2 things. My biggest worry is that Christian mission will be diluted because of financial pressures. And my biggest hope, I guess, hope is that we need more faith, hope, and love in the world. And Christian colleges are the place in which that is distilled in a really sophisticated and intricate way. And that's what I think the future looks like.
Gayle?
Yeah, if you just study the enrollment demographics, we know we're in a 7-year uptick right now. 26, 27 will begin down. So in 32, 33, it'll start back up. So 10 years out, we're in a trough. 15 years out, we're back on an upward trajectory, and that's going to have an impact on what kinds of innovation. We're going to have to come up with programs that are innovative. We're going to have to continue to depend on people that will commit years and years of their life to prepare to be faculty at our institutions. We need senior administrators that are both committed to the gospel, tuned in it, but also have great acumen in terms of financial wherewithal. I think you have to do everything you can between now and 15 years out to ensure your financial sustainability. And we have a major planned gift program. We also have a major gift program. And the two have to run in parallel. You need people who are going to eventually go to heaven to leave their estates, parts of their estates to you. But as much as you can ensure or safeguard your own financial viability, that's to your favor. And I think we've got a short-term period to get our enrollment adjusted, and then we're going to go into a 7-year period that's really hard, and then 15 years out, I think we'll be back into another growth period, but it's going to look very different. And it's just unclear. Some of it will remain the same. It'll really be driven by what are the dimensions of the country in terms of the value of education that we provide.
Great. Well, thank you, Gayle, Shirley, and Kevin, for your faithful leadership in each of your institutions and for your time this afternoon. We're really grateful that you would spend an hour with us. And thanks to all of you, the attendees, for joining earlier today and this afternoon. For those of you who are tuning in for the last breakout session at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, you can click on the link in the email that you should have received from our team to get into that webinar. But we'll also be providing some additional opportunities this summer for faculty to engage with each other and with our scholars and other experts. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, have a great afternoon and a great start to your summers. Thanks all.